Good afternoon. Welcome to the 2018 Sloan Sports Analytics Conference. I am very excited today to be presenting our panel, Creating a New Stat. My name is Dan Stavens. I'm a first-year MBA at MIT Sloan. So first, I'd like to introduce all of our panelists here today. First, we have Voris McCracken, sabermetrician. We have Keith Woolner, principal data scientist, baseball analytics for the Cleveland Indians. We have John Hollinger, executive vice president of basketball operations at Memphis Grizzlies. We have Brian Burke, working for the Stats Information Group at ESPN, as well as a senior analytics specialist. And our moderator today is going to be Neil Greenberg, staff writer for the Washington Post. If you have any questions you want to include for the Q&A session, you can do so by tweeting new stat, and the top tweets will be included by our moderator for the Q&A session. The panel will run for 40 minutes, with 5 minutes at the end for questions. And with that, Neil, take it away.
How's everybody doing? We appreciate you coming on towards the end of the Sloan Conference, but on behalf of all the panelists here, we want to thank you for joining us today. As Dan said, we have a panel called Creating a New Stat, and I know that he introduced the panelists by name, but I just want to quickly go through some of the innovations that they did. We have Voris, who turned the baseball world upside down with his defense-independent pitching metrics. He pretty much said that the pitcher, maybe not as valuable or maybe not as influential on some of the balls hit in play are. And then we have Keith, who created the value above replacement, right, which is over replacement, which is now widely used on broadcast and has morphed into not only wins above replacement, but also into other sports. We have John Hollinger, who's, no joke, created so many stats. I brought one up earlier and he forgot that he actually created it. But some of the stats are the player efficiency rating, known as PER, and also the game score, which is actually an adaptation on a metric that Bill James created for baseball, right? And a bunch of others we'll get into. Incidentally, John promised to give us all the proprietary information that the Memphis Grizzlies are using. So if he doesn't on this panel, I tried. And then we have Brian Burke from ESPN, who has taken the win probability aspect and made it visual. If you've ever been on ESPN's box scores, especially for football, you may notice in some of the information there's a win probability, and tells you who's winning by how much, or at least how you can expect to win. It causes absolutely no grief among anybody and any strata of any fan base at all.
There have only been 3 panels that talked about it.
Right. So it's a highly controversial metric, but I think it's one that's important, especially visually. So I'll start with Voris, not only because he's on the end, but because I think that when you talk about disruption and creation and really getting into the nitty-gritty of what it means to, in my word, revolutionize a sport, just to set the tone of the climate, baseball has been rooted in statistics for centuries, right? And you had the evolution to maybe looking at OPS, on-base plus slugging, as a very valuable indicator of player value. And then Moneyball came, and that kind of made it a little bit more accessible, at least in terms of the public. But in between those two things, as I said, Voris came up with his defense-independent pitching stats and literally befuddled people in all walks of baseball. So Voris, my first question to you is, how do you come up with that?
Well, actually, the genesis of it was from Baseball Prospectus. Keith was working on it at the time, and at the end of the book, there was a section about separating out the contributions from the pitcher from the contributions of the fielders behind him. And sorry to do this, Keith, but the response was the response that was published in that Baseball Prospectus was that there was no real way to do this. And I thought that was a really, really crummy way to go about solving this problem, was to give up immediately.
Thank you.
And so I'm like, all right, if I was going to go about, trying to separate this, how would I do it? And so what I decided to do was separate out the pitching statistics into 2 groups. One's the defense can't affect: walks, strikeouts, home runs, and ones they can: hits and everything else. And when I went through this, just the basic thing, I was expecting it to be, half here, and so forth and so on. It turned out almost all of what we consider to be good pitching is all over here. And good pitching is like, at this point, it's about this much over in the things.
Which was not conventional wisdom at the time by any stretch.
No, everyone said I was crazy and that I should shut up. Which is basically most of the time when I talk, that's what they say.
You'll see a running theme of that, in all seriousness, throughout the panel, that at some point, someone told one of these gentlemen to shut up.
Right.
I may have to during the panel, but...
And one of the great things about that period of time were just the access of the internet and the growing access to people who had statistics, baseball statistics databases, was ultimately people didn't have to take my word for it. Ultimately, other people could come in and do the same work I did, look at the same things I did, and say, okay, maybe he might be onto something. Bill actually was one of the first people, and I'm so grateful for this, to go through when he published his historical abstract. And he, there's maybe, he may go too far here, there may be certain things here, he says, but for the most part, this all checks out.
Yeah, and I believe, and Bill's actually here, he can correct me if I'm wrong, Bill James wished he thought of it himself, if I remember correctly. And when Bill James, who pretty much created all this stuff, says, you know what, I wish I thought about that, you're onto something. But it went against the grain completely at the time.
No, yeah, it was not what people were doing. People were using ERA. In fact, there was a strain of thought that came over from hitting that strikeouts were actually overvalued when it came to evaluating pitchers. And the consequence of what I was saying was it was, in fact, the most important statistic when it came to evaluating pitchers.
Yeah. Now, Keith was developing his own metrics at the time. As a matter of fact, he was telling us earlier, he was at the first Sloan conference, at the first Sloan panel, and asked the first question back when he had to submit it on a stone tablet, I think you said. You had to pass it along, get it up on the stage.
Yes, they had to run it in from ancient Greece.
So you were in the statistical movement at the time, right? The late 90s when VARs came out. What did you think of his findings, especially as someone that was developing their own work at the time at Baseball Prospectus?
Well, like everyone else, I thought he was totally nuts. But he put together a good argument, and that's ultimately what changes minds. I actually had done some research for a guy who was writing an article about sort of the history of dips and VARs and stuff, and I collected some comments from the pre-VARs era from Red Sport Baseball, which was the online baseball discussion community before we had Fangraphs and Prospectus and so on. And collected a bunch of comments from people talking about, oh, well, you have to include, batting average on balls in play in some sense that this is a key estimate of figuring out what a pitcher is worth. And there was one quote in particular that said that, if you don't believe that, then you would have to assume that, everything you need to know about a pitcher is based on his strikeout rate, his walk rate, and his home run rate, and nothing about the type of batted balls he gives up, which, seems completely implausible to me. And I thought, oh, who is this poor soul that said that? And then I realized it was me. So,
and they say we're not self-aware. Yeah, so my next question is to John from the front office aspect. There are a lot of new stats that aren't innovative, right? There are new stats that either tell us what we already know, or they don't necessarily tie it back to a player's performance or winning. And as a member of a front office, what is it about new stats or new ways of looking at things that impresses you, that you're able to say to yourself, you know what, this is something that could be valuable?
Yeah, I think it's a question of immediate relevance, right? Of does this thing describe what happened? Is it predictive of what's going to happen? Does it convey some kind of advantage that isn't within the present stats that we have already? And that ends up being a pretty high bar for most numbers to clear. Now, we're also in this other era now where we're in a data deluge, so to speak, especially compared to the Stone Ages when we started doing this stuff. We were talking about the halcyon days of Lotus 1, 2, 3 spreadsheets before, which like 4 people in this room have actually used for looking at the faces. But now we have all this stuff. We have tracking cameras in NBA arenas that are just putting out reams of data every single game, 8 pictures a second of 10 players and where they are and where the ball is heading, velocities and vector and positions, and so making sense out of all of that information. Whereas at the beginning of this, it was a question of really, can we get any information at all? And then what do we do with that information once we have it? Now it's like, oh my God, we have so much information. How do we process this? How do we manage it? How do we separate the wheat from the chaff?
Yeah. And for those of you that don't know, the NBA's camera system was actually adapted from missile defense technology. That's how it's used to track so much stuff. So it's actually good that we have a fighter pilot on the panel today in Brian. Now my question for Brian is, as part of ESPN Sports and Information Group, you have access to a lot of data to begin with.
Yep.
And then you talk about, as John alluded to, pretty much turning on the fire hose of data just coming at you. Yep. So how do you know what data to use, and how do you go about kind of triage of data that's coming in? Because I've seen the data that you have to work with, and it is massive.
Yeah, does it improve the error in the cross-validation set or not?
Say that in English.
No, use it all. Use everything you can, everything that's possible. I think it's important to, John said, separate the wheat from chaff, and I think that's an important theme. So you could say wheat and chaff or signal and noise or bias and variance, and it's a lot of the same thing. I think the core function, the core approach when creating a statistic, like dips is a great example, is, hey, the batted balls are the chaff, the signal, the strikeouts, the home runs, that's the wheat. That's what's really predictive. So what is truly predictive and what is noise? In football, turnover rates, fumble recovery rates don't correlate from season to season very well. They don't even correlate, for a team, from odd games to even games. So you can say, okay, this is noise. So if we want to predict something in the future, let's use the wheat. Let's use the signal. So I think that's one of the core attributes of any statistic that you want to create.
Yeah, I think another, even before you get that far, is really figuring out what is the question that you want to answer. Right? There's a lot of data. Sometimes we take the data, I think, to fit the question, but knowing what your purpose is important. So I'll turn it back to Voros. What question were you trying to answer at the time that you were looking at pictures and said to yourself, there's got to be a better way?
That was really, because you can see it. And maybe it was growing up. I grew up a Cubs fan in the late 70s, and there was a pitcher the Cubs had back then by the name of Rick Russell, who was a fantastic pitcher and got very little credit for it because he was playing in a terrible stadium with a terrible defense behind him and just a terrible team behind him. But you could see it as you watch baseball games. You could see how much bigger an advantage the Yankees and the Dodgers pitchers had over the guys who were pitching for poor teams, even if they were very good pitchers. You could see that the fielders were not contributing. Back in the 80s, it was the St. Louis Cardinals. They caught everything their pitchers, got hit off of them. And none of it was being taken into account. Pitchers were being judged by their earned run average, despite the fact that their fielders behind them were contributing heavily to this. And I'm like, there's got to be a way to go after this. There has to be a way to go after this numerically to try and come up with a better way to evaluate pitchers. And the real question is not so much what I was trying to solve, but why it interested me so much. I mean, why do I care? And I think
because you were told it was impossible to do.
That might be part of it.
It's a great motivator.
That might be part of it. I think
I'm glad you accepted my challenge.
I think the bigger aspect of it is sometimes, and this is still true of me today, sometimes what motivates me is I want to know something tomorrow that I don't know today. And that's all there is. And at that time, I didn't know. I didn't know how to separate out the effects of the fielders from the pitching staff. And it motivated me to find out.
It's got to be a little bit, maybe disheartening is not the right word, but here you are having a completely rational thought process, coming up with a completely rational way of looking at stuff, and almost the entire baseball community is telling you that you're wrong.
It's hard, but what I think most people don't know or understand was when I first came up with it, this was not what I was expecting to come up with. I was expecting something else to show up. But when it came out the way that it did, I mean, just as an example, it was supposed to be a 2-part process, but when I got done with the first part, I was like, wait a minute, something's up here.
Right.
The first part was the top 5 pitchers in the first part were, Randy Johnson, Mike Mussina, Greg Maddux, who were the best 5 pitchers.
Yeah.
And so if the first part identifies the best 5 pitchers, regardless of, what year it is, what is the second part? What is it? And that took me away from what I expected to see to what I actually was seeing. And so that is what, my expectations were the same as everybody else. My expectation is this couldn't be right, but I went where the data took me.
John, you must have had a similar experience when you developed your player efficiency rating, which was here you are trying to put players in tiers or groupings or rankings or however you want to do it in terms of their performance. Were you surprised by the way that your metric was ranking players? Did you get pushback on that, or did you have some other challenges?
Well, the evolution of it, I guess, was a little different because it was able to evolve a little bit over time. I had a website in the late '90s, and there were like 12 people on the internet then, so it was a small core of people who were looking at this, and I was able to evaluate the formula quite a bit. It didn't come out in one aha moment, I think, the way it did for you. It was more of just an iterative trial and error, and error and error and error and error and error, and really trying to formulate exactly how to create it. What I want to do is just the fan in me just want to know, is player X better than player Y? And the way basketball stats were, it was just really hard to do that. You couldn't tell by points per game, and guys were playing different number of minutes, and there was just too much. The information wasn't conducive to making comparisons. So that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to be able to compare between seasons. I wanted to be able to compare between players, compare players on different teams. And so it was just this very iterative thing where I finally ended up in a place where I could do that. Now, fortunately, the baseball people came along first, because when I saw how critical sort of the establishment was of them, I knew to expect that from the basketball side. And actually, it was less that way than I thought. I think basketball in general is just less kind of hidebound than baseball can be. So that actually surprised me a little bit.
It's interesting that you mentioned that, because you can certainly see baseball being on the forefront of the analytics movement. Basketball very quickly burst onto the scene in terms of how quickly they absorb data. I'm going to turn it back to Brian for a second, because many of you might be familiar with Brian's work on ESPN and know about the win probability. But before he was doing that, he was operating his own site and actually trying to value NFL players. And the way that he went about it, and I think that this was what drew me to Brian's site when he first had it up, was he wasn't so much concerned about the ranking of players. He was much more concerned about 2 things. 1, how much is that player worth in the actual marketplace? And 2, how does that tie back to wins? So Brian, can you talk about a little bit of you had your wins probability added and also your expected points added, I believe, and that's actually morphed over to ESPN as well.
Yes, right. Well, those concepts have been in place, and baseball had those, and you can do that. Those concepts are universal to sports. It's a matter of harnessing them in the right way and thinking about them in the right way. So one of the functions of a statistic like that is dimensionality reduction. So you might have lots of different components of a basketball player, steals, rebounds, shots made, all kinds of different, and you want to distill that into one variable. So, simple example, you have an X coordinate and a Y coordinate, and Pythagorean distance, that's just the distance between. So you're losing some information, but it's still really, really useful, and now it's just one number. So that's part of the value of something like expected points added, win probability added. You've taken a really complex problem space, high dimensionality in the problem, converted into lower dimensions, which now you can kind of the human brain can process a lot easier. The second thing is it's in units that are meaningful. So when you talk about the units of win probability added is wins. The units of expected points added is points. And those are things that coaches and GMs and that's the currency, that's the objective function of this whole, the entire point of a sports team. So people can relate. And when you have that, it's not only relatable to maybe somebody who's less initiated in analytics, it's also, I lost my train of thought. Oh, you can also compare, let's say, the value of a sack to the value of a touchback, or the value of a 20-yard pass completion, things that you couldn't really put your finger on, or even the value of something like quarterback scrambling ability, yards gained on the ground compared to the yards he gains through the air. So before that, you really didn't have any common frame of reference to even make those comparisons. So I think those are the two big benefits.
And I think Brian brings up a good point in terms of the language that's used, right? Being able to talk in a language that makes sense to people. I don't know if there's any hockey fans out here, but hockey has dabbled in analytics for a while, and they had a stat created that was called the Corsi stat. And it essentially measured shots for and against and was a proxy of puck possession in hockey, which if you ask any coach to rank how important puck possession was, they'd say it's pretty important. You ask them how important Corsi was, they would tell you that it's garbage and they don't pay attention to it. And that was kind of a language barrier. So does that factor in when you're looking to create a stat and then you have to go put it out in the wild? How much thought do you give into what it's going to be called, and how much thought do you give into what that's going to represent to the public at large? Let's start with Voros, because he's thinking about it pretty intently.
No, because what I would currently recommend is not what I actually did. Back then, and it was a product of the time. There was this thing, and I partook in it, same as everybody else, where everyone was coming up with cutesy little acronyms for their stuff. And so I went defensive independent pitching statistic DIPS as part of my cutesy acronyms. Nowadays, I really would not recommend doing that sort of thing. But there was a charm to it at the time as well, in that when I came up with this, the idea wasn't that I was creating a product that I was going to market so that I could get myself work in baseball. I was just kind of screwing around and having fun. It became my career, as it turns out, because back then, there really wasn't this idea that there were going to be fleets of analytics departments on baseball teams. This was not
very much the
going
opposite.
on. This was not what was going on, and this was not what anybody. It had happened before, and Craig Wright was doing it. And every time it had happened, the results were the person who was stuck. The first ones out of the foxhole. They took a whole lot of cannon fire, and so there was this idea that this just wasn't going to happen, and so that wasn't really on my mind. Nowadays, that should definitely be on your mind, that this is more of a professional sort of thing.
It's much easier to get it out there, too, with social media.
Right, and it's out there and so forth. So yeah, so my answer is I did a really, really bad job of naming my thing, but I did it because that's the way we were doing things back then.
Keith, I want to bring it back to you for a second. Your value over replacement level, I think, is pretty aptly named, and it's stood the test of time. Did you ever worry, or was there ever any pushback of having these all-in-one statistics, which can, in a sense, limit the debate around a player, as opposed to opening it up because you're trying to put everything that a player does in every single sport in one number, which may or may not be realistic?
Yes and no. I mean, there's an attempt to bring as much as we knew at the time into kind of metric, although VORP itself was very explicit about excluding defense. So it didn't know anything about how good a shortstop played his position, because at the time the defensive metrics that we had were way behind what we understood on the offensive side. So, made a conscious decision on VORP. It's just, I'm going to punt on that. We're going to assume everyone's an average defender.
Right. Brian will tell you when you should punt. Let him handle that part of the...
The MIT students.
They got a twitch.
I thought Brian was going to lash out at me. Did we get that on tape? It's okay.
And await further developments about what we were going to do with defense, and then make it compatible so that you could add it in later. But yeah, there's always a certain resistance to you reducing it. You're reducing your dimensionality all the way down to one number. But when it comes down to it, you're making a decision about, do I want that player or this player, or am I going to pay this amount of money for that player? And it's a yes-no decision. And if you're comparing two of them, there's got to be some way that you can compare, I want this one more than I want this one. And you can, that comes down to, some kind of a value you're placing on each of them.
John, I'll ask the same question to you, because player efficiency rating is heavily weighted towards offense.
Yeah.
And since the advent of the sports view cameras and the second spectrum and data collection, there's been more done on the defensive side of the ball as well. Do you, in hindsight, would you want to include more of the defensive metric in PER, or were you satisfied that it encompassed what it encompassed and used that as your rating?
I really struggled with how to try to account for defense more in that rating when I created it. So I would have loved to, I guess, take another stab at it with all the information we have today. But I don't know what I came up with. The piece I sort of made with it is what I came up with describes what it describes really well. So let's be okay with that, and then let's deal with what it's not describing. But that, like he said, I mean, we were dealing with the same thing in basketball. That was the information we had at the time.
Right.
So I think it was important not to take a set of information that was much, much more uncertain than other pieces of information you had and try to combine them together, because it throws the entire accuracy of what you're trying to measure off.
Yeah, exactly. You're throwing bad money after good at that point.
Right,
You're like you're sullying your
right.
creation.
Or I can predict how many children a family will have, plus or minus 100. That's not a useful metric for most families.
Some of you now are actually in front offices and are using this data to evaluate players and teams. What's the biggest challenge of doing that when you have stats on one side, right, and you have your scouting department making eyeball decisions on the other side? What's the right balance, do you think? I know it should be 50-50, but is that possible to get to a 50-50 balance, or is there sometimes where one takes precedent over the other?
Well, I think I disagree with the premise of the question.
Great, let's fight.
That you have stats on one side and scouting or expert assessment on the other. They're both sources of information, and if you're doing things right, you are treating them equally as sources of information, and then you test and you figure out which ones are valuable, which ones are predictive of the decisions that you need to make. And you shouldn't be beforehand prioritizing one over the other. They're stronger together because they are each illuminating parts of the problem of understanding what a player is in ways that complement each other rather than conflict with each other. So once you get an organizational buy-in to the idea that all of these kinds of information are useful, and we have people that have expertise in one, expertise in the other, but they respect the points of view and the expertise that they have, then you get a better decision-making process out of it.
John, I saw you nodding your head.
I mean, the premise that these are opposing forces, I think, is something that has gone away. So I'm glad you said that. I do think, though, that one of the things we really ask our scouts to do is find the things that the numbers can't tell us, right? Because we always say the stats see every game, but they don't see some of the other things that I think scouts can see in terms of how is this guy wired, what is his work ethic, what are all these things that describe this person. At the end of the day, we're basically HR departments, right? We're trying to solve a hiring problem by predicting what these people are going to do in future years, and so there are numbers that are predictive that help with that, but then there's other information that we also need in order to make that predictive assessment.
I'm going to counter this a little bit, just a little. I mean, Keith is absolutely right that the best way to do this is to combine the two. The problem is when you have these discussions in the draft room and your pick comes up, you just get the one guy, okay? Somebody's going to win that argument. And the fact of the matter is time and time again, when you have the stat guy in the room and the scout guy in the room, time and time again, there is going to be significant disagreements about which guy that ought to be. Somebody is going to win that argument and somebody's going to lose it. And so, yes, you need to combine the information, you need to do all these things. Nevertheless, I don't think we can as easily dismiss that there is going to remain some small sort of conflict, professional conflict, good, healthy conflict, but I think that conflict is going to continue to be there because it has to be there. I have to present what I believe is right, and the scouts have to present what they believe is right, and very often there are going to be, opposing opinions. And I don't think you can necessarily downplay that these sorts of conflicts have gone away. Have they lessened? Do the two sides respect each other much more? Yes. Is the conflict still there? Yes, and I think it's going to continue to be there. I'm not sure that's a bad thing.
I just think it's funny that when I started coming here a few years ago, the big question was, hey, when are we going to be accepted by these sports teams? And when are they going to start listening to us?
That was like last year.
And then, and now the question is, hey, what are we going to do with all these old school people left over in our organization? Maybe we can put them in the HR department.
I'm just happy to hear there's so much conflict in the draft room that Boris is.
Well, it's an interesting subject, right? So there's definitely room for everybody's voice at the table, and this brings me back to the AllinOne Metrics. Is it possible that you have a player that maybe ranks high overall, but you need a defensive specialist, right? And then you kind of have to weigh the pros and cons of bringing a player that may help you a lot in one area, but may not help you or may hurt you in another area. Is it difficult to keep those decisions?
It depends, at least in baseball, it depends on what stage of the career the player is in. If you're looking to hire someone who's 26 years old to help your team this year, then yes, obviously that's crucial. If you're drafting a high school kid, you don't know when it's time for him to start playing for you. You don't really know what your situation is going to be, and so you really are trying to just get the best available guy. So in baseball anyway, it's where along the path of his career is, matters how much that really matters.
And the more time horizon you have, like a draft pick in baseball, you have more opportunity to treat that as a fungible asset. You can convert a pitcher into a position player through trade, or finding an asset that at that time fits what your team needs are.
And this also depends on what stage of the competitive cycle each team is on. Right. Keith's team right now is trying to win championships right now. Other teams in the league are not.
Right. Do you think he's got a good
chance?
chance?
Boros clearly isn't trying to do that.
John?
I think it also, in basketball, it's because it's a more fit-dependent sport. I think that probably matters more. To give one obvious example, if you have one or two major players on your team already who are not good shooters, adding another non-shooter is going to immediately make a huge problem for you. And so there are I guess network effects you'd call them that exist in basketball that probably don't apply as much in baseball into how much into the way you construct your team and the limits on fewer players on the
Baseball
court, smaller
more
rosters.
More separable, and you have
Yeah.
fewer interaction effects than you do in football or basketball.
Yeah, football is a lot.
Yeah, football has a lot of moving parts. Brian's audience, I think, is more public-facing than the other three panelists. So my question to Brian is, you can have the discussion at the player level in the meeting. Your discussions are a lot different. Your discussions is it based on usefulness? Is it based on what can enhance some of the other products ESPN has putting out? Can you walk us a little bit through that process of what it's like having a front-facing, by that I mean a public stat, like win probability, versus an internal debate as to how good of a player is or isn't?
Well, we've gone through that with QBR, our quarterback rating, total QBR. Yeah, there's a balance that we walk. ESPN has a very, very broad audience. It's not the same audience as Baseball Prospectus.
Has anyone heard of ESPN that's even in the audience? Oh, you have? Okay.
Yeah.
I want to say I worked. Did I work?
Oh, you know them?
Yeah.
Oh, because I asked Ben earlier. He's like, who?
Does anybody know what the E stands for in ESPN?
Entertainment.
Besides my coworkers.
Esports.
E. E stands for entertainment, right? So if you make your audience, if you present them something complex that, even took us probably years to understand, right? But it seems natural and intuitive to people like us now. It's unfair to expect an audience, a more broad general audience, to see that and not feel like stupid. If you make half your audience feel dumb by presenting something really complex that takes a hard time to learn, like we all felt in algebra class or calculus class, for the first few weeks, that's not a good thing. We're trying to entertain fans. Part of that is informing them and enriching their knowledge and enhancing their understanding of a sport and how players contribute to success. But yeah, we do walk that fine line and make sure we keep things entertaining. But our job as analysts is to keep our assessments as true and accurate as possible.
How do you deal with the challenge of, I'm familiar with QBR, it's a list of quarterbacks that are good to not so good. How do you handle the feedback when they tell you how stupid you are because you have quarterback A ahead of quarterback B? And the QBR process is relatively transparent, but there are some cases where your ranking might be different, certainly in the heart of the fan, but also perhaps other metrics that are out there.
Right, it's doing the best it can with the data that it's given, and I would say it's like democracy, right? The best except for all the other alternatives. It is far from perfect, but it does incorporate a lot of concepts and advances. I mean, it's even part of it's based off of DIPS concepts. So the idea.
I'll expect the check next week.
Yeah. So air yards is something. We talked about yards after the catch. This was like the buzzword before. Set the edge. Wide nine. So yards after the catch was big. I thought, why aren't we talking about the yards before the catch and assessing quarterbacks in that way? So air yards is kind of one of the core components of QBR, and that came out of DIPS. So yeah, the yards after catch was the chaff, and the air yards was the wheat, to use that phrase. So I'm sorry, I forgot the original question.
Don't worry about it. Your answer is better.
I'm sure what I said was very interesting.
No, I mean, fortunately, internet commenters, they prefer polite civil discourse.
I'm sure you get no suggestions of what to do with the Grizzlies.
Obviously, when this stuff was out on ESPN as well, when I was there for 8 years, the thing I always tried to keep in my head was when they say you're an idiot, don't listen. But when they say why you're an idiot, take a look at that, because there might be a kernel of a suggestion in there that can help refine your method. Or
Someone once told me that don't think of them as angry fan mail, think of them as love letters from angry people. So I always took that.
I had someone suggest that my only use to a baseball team would be as a hot dog vendor.
Well, you showed them, Boris.
Hopefully.
We got a couple minutes here before our question and answer. Real quick, what type? We have a lot of students out here, a lot of people that are trying to make their mark. What would you say is the area that could use more analytics research right now, either in your respective field or a different sport?
I would say I'm looking less for analytic research to come out of the public sphere and more analytic talent showing what they can do, because then we can bring them in and have them working on the problems that are of most interest to us and with the proprietary data and stuff that we have now. Certainly in baseball, the StatCast data has been the latest volcano of data that is spewing everywhere, and there's a lot of value to be mined out of that, I think. That's hard to do on the outside because baseball has not made it publicly available. But I'd much rather see you tackle an interesting problem with publicly available data that maybe doesn't create the next DIPS, but shows me that you're capable of doing really good original research.
I think that's the key, is that the real heart of excellent analytics is a human thought process. It is not a technological thing. You can do some of the best analytics laying on your couch staring at the ceiling. I mean, there is a thought process that is essential to good analysis. And when you bring the data in to that thought process, that's where you can get the most out of the data, is if you go in there having thought about the problem first.
Yeah, it's a scientific research process at the end of the day. I think pretty much every NBA team would tell you that every year we spend more on injury prevention, and every year we have more injuries in the league. So I would say that's certainly a promising area for anyone to try to research and make an impact. I think that's probably the next frontier for us.
In football, it's player evaluation. I think we've largely solved the kind of in-game decision stuff that I had been working on for a long time, and now it's player evaluation. And I think the player tracking data that's coming online now is going to go a long way to be able to do that. So those interaction terms between players, you have like 22 factorial interactions or something going on the football field on every play, and they're all designed to confuse you in the first place. It's a very difficult problem, but now with the tracking data and the advancements in machine learning all coming online all at the same time, you have this convergence of data and technology that's going to be able to make sense of that. So player evaluation through the player tracking.
All right, well, we got some questions here. One of them, what's the most overrated, useless statistic that is widely accepted in sports? I won't expect any of the panel to answer. I will answer. It's plus minus in hockey by far without even a distant second. I just think that it's
Passer rating.
It's passer rating. Well, Brian will answer. He says it's passer rating. Why is passer rating troublesome?
It double counts certain things, and the coefficients are totally arbitrary. It was made up by some guy who worked at the Pro Football Hall of Fame. He tinkered with the numbers and coefficients to try to add up to 100.
All right, there you go. Passer rating. All right. Someone also asked for some reliable public statistic databases to use in an effort to create a new stat. I will say NBA has done a great job of being transparent with a lot of their statistics, and they're coming up with new ones every day. I think baseball has done a good job of.
Well, we've had, the layman database is.
I was about to say the retro sheet. You want to talk about the
retro
layman
sheet is
database?
online, and in terms of just not so much the database, but the data out there. Fangraphs has tons of data. Baseball Reference. I mean, we're very fortunate in baseball that we're swimming in data now.
Yeah, and the layman database goes back, I want to say, to the 19th century.
The DIPS research. The DIPS research that did back in 1999 was only possible because of the layman database.
Right.
So.
Yeah. I'm jealous of baseball. Like, you guys have better data from games in 1880 than we do from games in 1980. It's insane.
Yeah, if you want to know how many hits Honus Wagner had in the third inning of a game, the layman database probably has it. And then there's one more question. How much context do you think is needed for statistics to make them more digestible for casual fans? I think this is also something that baseball is doing. I know Tom Tango there knew he had the data for exit velocity, knew he had the launch angles, knew that people would kind of get lost in the minutia, so named them barrels, right? Hits on the sweet spot of the bat. How much more context do you think we need among some of the statistics that are being used?
Well, I think
for us, it may be different than for someone.
No, I mean,
public, right?
it is. My job is not statistics or technology or analytics. My job is baseball.
Right.
And so in terms of the context, that's the context you have to start with. You have to start with the fact that you are about to talk about baseball. You're not about to talk about statistics. You need to talk about baseball. And if you keep that thought process in mind, I think the context, you'll get the right context from there.
And that's true for all sports, would you agree?
Yeah, they're all about baseball.
All about baseball.
I think it's an evolution over time too, right? Like, you don't just create something and then everyone starts using it right away.
Right.
You know?
Wouldn't that be awesome?
There's a whole process. Bill created runs created back in the day, and then it took a while for that to kind of take hold with people And
You have to know what you can assume about what your audience knows. And if my audience is Chris Antonetti and Mike Chernoff, it's very different than if I am writing for an audience at Baseball Prospectus.
Right.
And so you need to tailor the style of communication and how much context and explanation you give based on that.
Any final thoughts, Brian?
It depends what you mean by context, definitely. I mean,
Oh, we have like 20 seconds. Just... All right, thank you. For Brian, for Boros, for Keith, for John, from me, thank you for being a part of the panel. Hope you enjoyed it.